Go sports. That is the last time you will ever hear me say such a thing.
And show me.
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Today I'm going to be talking about a new sports drama called Him. Overall, my feedback is mixed. There are things that I rate favorably and others less so, but ultimately I would tip my rating to be ever so slightly more in the favorable direction because Him is largely carried by its lead performers and enough of a stylish delivery to carry viewers through the more confusing narrative choices, or at least that was my experience with it. Clearly, many others are not happy with that, and I can see why that's the case, but more on that in a moment. The film's premise reads, after suffering a potentially career-ending brain trauma, Cameron Cade receives a lifeline when his hero, legendary 8-time championship quarterback and cultural megastar Isaiah White, offers to train Cam at Isaiah's isolated compound that he shares with his celebrity influencer wife. But as Cam's training accelerates, Isaiah's charisma begins to curdle into something darker. Cam is portrayed by Tyriq Withers, whom we have mentioned before here on my channel. I reviewed the new I Know What You Did Last Summer film favorably because it was for the girls and I had a fun time with it. And then my most recent video I published here on YouTube was a source material video on the upcoming film Reminders of Him, and Tyriq will be playing the male romantic lead of that story. A lot of the praise has gone to Marlon Wayans for his performance, and deservedly so, but we will get to that momentarily. Tyriq's performance works well for me because Cam has to come across as someone sweet, someone that's going to be tempted, maybe corrupted, and when he has a particular look on his face, this sort of wide-eyed, I don't know if innocence would be the word, he's a grown man, but he's the film's version of an ingenue. He's trusting of this heroic figure, this football icon he's looked up to since he was a child, and maybe it's a bit naive to be that trusting of someone just because they're famous and you think you know them, but you really don't. Also, for any of my regular viewers who follow along with source material coverage or identify as a romance girly, I will have you know that one of the most random tidbits that caught me off guard when watching Him was the declaration that Tyriq Withers is 6'5". They said that in the film and that had me going, wait, is that real or are we just saying things? And I looked it up. It's true. 1.96 meters. And that was so odd to me because I never regarded him as being short, but I didn't know he was that tall. I'm sure the romance girlies who are hyperactive on social media will respond very normally to that information when the Reminders of Him promotion really begins to flare up.
Are you out of your mind? She wants you.
Okay, don't do that.
But anyways, moving on to Marlon Wayans. He plays Isaiah White, a legendary football player whom Cameron has looked up to since he was a child. His performance is definitely a major strength of the film. He's a larger-than-life icon, but the more time that you spend with him, the more that his uglier, more insidious qualities begin to emerge. I don't know why some people are acting surprised that Marlon Wayans can also do dramatic acting in addition to his prolific body of work and comedy. Did some people apparently miss the part where a lot of his scenes in Scary Movie are off to the side of the rest of the ensemble because he was going back and forth between filming that and Requiem for a Dream? So there was a difference in his availability compared to some of his co-stars. When Cam comes to Isaiah's compound to begin his training, there's a gradual descent into things becoming weird, uncomfortable, violent, and it's addressing these ideas about how people with a dream can have their boundaries pushed, they can be put into really terrible situations and manipulated into something that they wouldn't normally want to do. You need an actor who can play the full range of that. Someone charismatic enough to look up to and trust, but also someone who can pull you downward gradually until their full nefarious ways are revealed. Marlon Wayans is the man for the job. But now that I've spoken about the strengths of the two leads, I will also give my perspective on some of what went wrong with the film to where it's being as heavily criticized as it is. And for now, I will do my best to explain this without getting into too many of the specifics. The film uses a lot of surrealism, and surrealism is inherently esoteric, especially when you put that in front of a general audience. If you want things to be presented in a manner that is very clear and matter of fact, you're probably going to be frustrated by this film. I think that once we got to the end, I could string everything together well enough to feel like I understood the larger picture of what they were trying to address and the journey they had Cam going on. But I can also understand why there are people who have watched this film and are still ultimately feeling frustrated by its execution overall. This film is only about an hour and a half long, so there's less time to share information about characters, the plot, but then the pacing reads as slow. A lot of viewers who are either less accustomed or entirely unaccustomed to watching older films might not have as much patience for slower pacing in a feature film on the big screen. When I think about older films, or even if we specifically focus on older horror films, oftentimes you don't see the same traits of modern horror films. Jump scares, a lot more graphic or explicit imagery. You don't have as much of a slow burn style of storytelling in modern horror. Not that it's never there, but simply that it's less common. There aren't a lot of scares in him, and there are much longer stretches, or they feel longer, between any of the more memorable violent incidents. Audience expectations are also going to impact how they experience a film at the cinema, because if you bring them in with the promise of something, and then they don't feel like what they were promised is being delivered upon, there's a decent chance they're going to lower their overall rating of that film more than they might have if they had simply watched the film without knowing anything about what the film was supposed to be. I will give you another example of this. Right after I saw him, I saw A Big, Bold, Beautiful Journey, and these were my two most anticipated films for this September. And A Big, Bold, Beautiful Journey was baiting the romance girlies. They were presenting themselves as doing this classic sort of old Hollywood romance, and I know that they had those sort of influences in mind because they had the movie posters, the soundtrack, and style of scoring. It was clearly aiming for that more old-fashioned, dreamlike quality. That being said, the romance girlies are famished, and we just want to see our main couple mooning over one another, having banter, luxuriating in one another's presence. So tell me why we are watching these two go off on numerous side quests individually of exploring some sort of origin story of various traumas and insecurities they have that are now blocking them psychologically from being able to jump headfirst into love. The romance girlies are exhausted. Enough of this deconstruction and psychological probing. We just want to see romance and whimsy. Deliver it or get out of the way for someone else who is up to that task. See, you didn't even know you would be getting 2 reviews for the price of 1 when you clicked on this video, but I was so over that last film that by the time we hit the point where Colin Farrell said, "I love you" to Margot Robbie, I audibly reacted. I think I said, "What?" or "Huh?" And I did this hand movement that indicated my disbelief. That's how ineffective they were at telling a love story.
No one knows what it is. It's like this mad riddle that no one knows what it is, right?
And speaking of hand movement reactions, I can understand why some people might not find him to be scary enough for a film that very much sold itself as a horror film, but there was a point where something spooky happened, and my hand reflexively clenched into a fist and it jerked as if I was preparing to throw a punch, which is quite funny to me in hindsight, considering that I don't fight. I looked down at my hand in disbelief as if to say, "Who do you think you are? Thing? You're growing sentient? About to run off on your own misadventures?" I would like to get into a few more specifics regarding him, so if you don't want to know anything else, although I can and do appreciate some of the film's merits, I do also recognize that there are issues with the narrative and pacing that are blocking a fair few viewers from being able to fully connect with what this film was aiming to do.
In this game, violence is rewarded, so learn to enjoy it. Get your shit together!
Now let's talk about just a couple of spoilers. When I saw this film's trailer, I saw footage or imagery that was of football players crashing into one another through a sort of X-ray-esque lens. So my immediate thought was that there was going to be more of a conversation about CTE than what was actually presented in the film. Now, if you're not already familiar, CTE is the abbreviation for chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is a medical condition that develops in people who repeatedly experience traumatic injuries to their brain. This is a more regularly occurring issue among professional athletes in sports that involve more contact, such as US football, mixed martial arts, boxing, rugby, just to name a few. And this can result in a number of cognitive issues, behavioral changes for the worse, speech impediments. There are just lots of different symptoms that can arise. This issue has become more commonly known, discussed, and researched to the point that I, as a person who has little to no interest in sports, I'm still aware of this condition and the fact that it is an issue that needs to be addressed and policies need to be implemented to help players to be more safe and receive any medical treatment that they might need. Cam experiences a blow to the head early on, and they really emphasize that there will be serious consequences if he gets another really bad head injury. But they don't really talk about CTE directly. Instead, the head injury comes across as a way to turn Cam into a potentially unreliable narrator where you don't always know whether or not what he's seeing is real. Is there something horrible or supernatural going on? Maybe it's both. Or is this merely something he's seeing as the result of a really bad head injury? It plays into this feeling of dread and uncertainty of him being out at this compound that's in the middle of nowhere without his mobile phone, since they made him turn that over first thing when he arrived. And when I look back on the film in totality, I feel as though it would have been a perfect way to bring in the concept of CTE if you had seen those older generations of football players and if they had turned into some sort of supernatural creature that was an allegory for CTE. Now, that's not to say that doing that one alteration would have fixed every issue with the film, but that's merely an example of a way that you could have reincorporated that idea. There are interesting concepts and imagery presented regarding religion and idol worship, whether that's deifying your heroes, professional athletes, celebrities, and the dangers that can come from doing that. One of the first things you're shown is a shelf where religious items and sports paraphernalia are displayed together, and it makes a strong statement about what the film is trying to say. This is recurring throughout the film, though. Late in the runtime, you see Cam seated at the center of a table where they have recreated the Last Supper painting by Leonardo da Vinci. I see that and immediately I know, oh, he's going to be betrayed. They're going to try to sacrifice him. It's very straightforward if you know the reference, which I would assume most people do. And once he's turned his back on this temptation and he's covered in blood, you see him holding his arms out, deliberately invoking the imagery of being sacrificed on a cross. But also, Cameron has been wearing a cross necklace throughout more or less the entire film that, if I remember correctly, belonged to his now deceased father. So there's clearly something else going on of being religious, of choosing his own values and family over the temptation of this wicked offer. Now, I'm not a theologist, so I don't feel equipped to form a full, elaborate theory and analysis of all of those elements of what the film is aiming to say, but I can, at the very least, recognize that there is a clear artistic and thematic intention of incorporating those sort of elements to the overall storytelling. I can pick up on enough of it to understand the ending a bit more and have it resonate beyond just the most surface level entertainment value of the horror movie Final Girl. She's 6'5", she's waving a sword around and taking down the bad guys. There is that deeper emotional and spiritual dimension to the film's ending. Now, all that being said, I did find that the surrealism was excessive to an extent that it felt as though the meaning and intention and themes were being obfuscated. When you log your reviews, you have to decide between the options of either fresh or rotten, and I really went back and forth while I was watching the film about where I was ultimately going to land. There are strengths and weaknesses, but as I've already said, I do understand why others are more upset than I am with the final result. There were a lot of expectations beforehand. The trailer looked very promising, and whenever you invoke Jordan Peele's name, people's expectations are raised. In online film spaces, Weapons is known to many as being the film that got away from Jordan Peele. He wanted to produce that film. Monkey Man was the film that Jordan Peele saved from direct-to-streaming purgatory. Both of those films were excellent, even though Jordan Peele wasn't even the one to direct them. Now, I looked up the Him director, Justin Tipping, and a lot of his work has been in television. He only has one other feature film that was released almost a decade ago, and I have not seen that yet, so I'm not able to comment on that. But I've mentioned this before on YouTube and probably on Patreon as well. I tend to be a bit more lenient on judging debut feature directors, or I suppose in this case, slightly less experienced feature directors, if I see that there are some good ideas, some decent visuals, even if you didn't completely win me over, I see promise here, and there are plenty of great directors that don't reach their full potential right away, so I'm willing to keep an open mind moving forward if he were to direct other films. And either way, what I ultimately got out of this was a really fun opportunity to see Marlon Wayans showing his skills on the big screen, which is a great warm-up for Scary Movie 6. And I got to see Tyriq Withers take center stage and be the protagonist, so I was able to get more of a read on his skills leading into the release of Reminders of Him. I've seen a lot more from Micah Monroe than I have from him, but now I feel more certain that he has great potential to play a convincing romantic lead, which might be odd to say after watching him be athletically and psychologically tormented, but I see the vision. It's transferable skills to go from him to a Colleen Hoover story.